The research vessel Starbound drifted through the empty space near the seventh moon of Kepler 442b, and the silence inside the ship felt heavy, like waiting for something bad to happen, but nobody knew what yet, and Dr. Maya Price stood at her scanning station, watching the green lines move across her screen in patterns that meant absolutely nothing unusual until suddenly they did. And the patterns changed into something that made her heart skip several beats at once, because the readings showed an energy signature so massive that it could only mean two things, and neither of them were good, and either her equipment was broken beyond all repair, or they had just found something that should not exist anywhere in the known universe. She called Captain Lauren Hayes to the bridge, and her voice stayed calm even though her hands were shaking, and Lauren arrived within 30 seconds because that tone meant something serious was happening. And Maya pointed at the screen where the energy readings pulsed like a heartbeat made of pure power, and Lauren stared at the numbers, and then stared at Maya, and then stared at the numbers again, because sometimes looking twice made impossible things make sense, but this time it did not help at all. Decided to investigate, because that was what research vessels did, even when every instinct screamed to run away, and the Starbound moved closer to the moon's surface, where crystalline caves reflected the distant starlight in ways that hurt to look at directly, and the energy signature grew stronger with each passing kilometer until the ship sensors started. It's making alarmed beeping sounds that meant they were detecting something beyond their programming capacity. Maya suited up along with 3 other crew members, and they took the shuttle down to the surface, and the moon had almost no atmosphere, which meant they needed full environmental suits, and the cave's entrance looked like a cathedral made by aliens who understood beauty in ways humans were still learning, and they walked inside with their helmet lights cutting through darkness that seemed older than stars themselves. The cave went deep and deeper still, and the walls were covered in symbols that Maya recognized from ancient texts about the precursors, and those were the beings who supposedly created civilization across the galaxy millions of years ago, and then vanished completely without leaving any explanation or forwarding address, and most scientists thought they were just myths and stories that primitive species told themselves to feel less alone in the universe. But these symbols were real, and they glowed with soft blue light that pulsed in time with that massive energy signature. Then they found her, and she was standing in the center of a massive chamber that was carved from a single piece of crystal that refracted light into colors that had no names in human language, and she was tall and impossibly beautiful, with pointed ears and silver hair that floated around her head like she was underwater, and her eyes glowed with the same blue light as the symbols, and next to her was a dragon, and not a small dragon or a reasonable size dragon, but a dragon the size of a small spacecraft, with scales that shimmered and changed colors like liquid starlight. Maya forgot how to breathe for several seconds, and the woman looked at them with curiosity and amusement, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like music and thunder mixed together. And she said she had been sleeping for a very long time, and asked if they were the ones who finally woke her up. And Maya managed to nod because her voice had temporarily stopped working. The woman introduced herself as Selenia, and the dragon was Ashvale, and she asked if the current galaxy was still dealing with the devourer problem, or if someone had finally taken care of that mess while she was napping. And Maya had no idea what devourers were, but she suspected they were not good. And Lauren, who had been listening through the communication link, asked Maya to bring their guest back to the ship, because talking in a crystal cave was not optimal for first contact protocols. Getting Selenia and Ashvale onto the Starbound proved challenging, because the dragon was really quite large, and Ashvale solved this problem by shrinking, and not shrinking in a normal way, but in a way that ignored physics and conservation of mass, and suddenly he was the size of a large dog, and he looked very pleased with himself, and Selenia patted his head and said he was showing off for the new people back on the Starbound. Lauren ordered a full scan of their guest, and the medical officer Kate Morgan ran every test in the database and then invented 3 new tests, because the first ones gave results that made no sense, and when the main computer finally processed all the data, it flagged Selenia with a designation that made everyone stop talking and stare at the screen in shocked silence. Computer had marked her as precursor class, and that designation was theoretical, and it was supposed to be impossible, and it meant that. Selenia was a member of the ancient race that seeded civilization across the galaxy and then disappeared, and she was sitting right there in their medical bay, drinking water from a plastic cup and looking around with interest at their primitive human. Technology Lauren asked Selenia if the designation was correct, and Selenia confirmed it with a casual shrugged and said yes, she was a precursor, or more specifically, she was a guardian, which was a special type of precursor, who fought the really dangerous things that wanted to eat galaxies, and Lauren processed this information and asked Selenia what she needed, and Selenia looked at the captain with ancient eyes and asked a question that nobody expected. She wanted to know if the precursor class designation came with free coffee because she had been asleep for several thousand years, and she was absolutely desperate for caffeine, and the bridge crew stared at her in confused silence until Maya started laughing, because sometimes the universe was so strange that laughter was the only appropriate response, and Kate went to get coffee from the gala. Selenia accepted the steaming cup with genuine gratitude and took a sip, and her eyes widened, and she declared that humans had created something surprisingly adequate and possibly even good, and she took another sip and smiled, and that smile made her look less like an ancient godlike being and more like a person who really enjoyed good coffee. The peaceful moment shattered when the ship alarms started screaming, and the tactical officer shouted warnings, and a massive warship dropped out of faster-than-light travel right next to them, and it was a Krell vessel. And the Krell were bad news because they had been conquering systems across this sector and destroying anyone who resisted, and they were violent and cruel and very good at killing things. The Krell ship hailed them, and the captain appeared on the view screen, and he was large and covered in scales and had too many teeth, and he demanded that the Starbound surrender the precursor artifact immediately, and he said they had 30 seconds to comply, or he would destroy the research vessel, and everyone aboard at Selenia had been drinking her coffee and enjoying the warmth. And when she heard the Krell captain call her an artifact, she paused and lowered her cup and asked Maya what the angry lizard man meant by artifact, and Maya explained that he meant Selenia herself, and the ancient woman face changed, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Selenia asked Lauren a simple question, and she wanted to know how many innocent worlds the Krell had destroyed, and Lauren answered honestly and said 17 confirmed colonies, and possibly dozens more. But they did not have exact numbers, and Selenia closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, they were glowing with power that made the lights flicker. She stood up, and Ashville, who had been napping in the corner, suddenly grew back to his full size, which should have been impossible inside the ship, but physics seemed to be taking a break, and the dragon scales reflected light that came from nowhere, and Selenia told Lauren that she was going to handle this situation, and the captain should probably make sure all crew members were secured because things were about to get extremely interesting. The Krell captain was still threatening them and counting down the seconds, and he reached 0 and fired weapons and massive energy beams, glanced toward the Starbound, and everyone braced for impact. But the beams never reached them, and Selenia had raised one hand, and the weapons fire stopped in midair and hung there frozen like someone had pressed pause on reality itself. Then she moved her other hand in a gesture that looked almost lazy, and the Krell warship shields collapsed, and their weapons powered down, and a glowing field surrounded their entire vessel and trapped them like insects in amber. And the Krell captain stopped talking and started looking worried, and Selenia smiled. But it was not a nice smile, and it promised that someone was going to have a very bad day. The Krell warship hung motionless in space, wrapped in energy that sparkled and hummed with frequencies that made human instruments give up trying to measure them, and Selenia stood on the bridge of the Starbound with her hands still extended and her eyes glowing brighter than before, and she looked at Lauren and asked permission to board the enemy vessel because she needed answers, and she needed them immediately, and Lauren gave authorization because what else could she do when a godlike being asked politely for permission? Celia and Asheville disappeared in a flash of light that left after images burned into everyone's vision, and they reappeared on the Krell bridge, according to the video feed that the Starbound computers somehow managed to intercept, and the Krell warriors tried to shoot them, but their weapons did not work, and Selenia walked through their attempts at violence. Like someone walking through light rain, and she approached the captain who was now backing away, and trying very hard not to show fear, but failing completely. She placed her hand on his forehead and light poured from her fingers and the Krell. Captain screamed, but not in pain, and it was worse than pain, because Selenia was reading his mind, and taking every memory, and every secret, and every piece of information that existed in his brain, and she did this for several minutes while Ashvale kept the other crew members frozen in place with just his presence and his eyes which glowed red, and promised death to anyone who interfered. When Selenia finished, she released the captain, and he collapsed to the floor, shaking. And she stood there, processing what she had learned, and her expression grew darker with each passing second, and she spoke to Lauren through the communication link, and her voice carried weight that made the bridge crew of the Starbound feel cold inside. She told them that the Krell Empire had been searching for precursor sites across the galaxy and enslaving populations and destroying resistance and stealing ancient technology, and but worse than that, much worse was that they had awakened something they should not have touched, and something that Selenia people had imprisoned millions of years ago, and something called a Devura Maya. Asked what a Devura was, and immediately wished she had not asked because Selenia description made her wish for ignorance again, and Devuras were parasitic entities that existed partially outside normal space. And they fed on death and destruction and negative emotions, and they could not be killed by normal means, and they grew stronger the more suffering they caused. And the precursors had fought a war against them that consumed entire galaxies and left scars. In reality, itself Selenia had been one of 12 guardians who fought that war, and she was the only one left, and she had gone into stasis, hoping that the Devourers would remain imprisoned forever, but the Krell had damaged the seals. And now one of them was loose and using the Krell Empire as puppets and feeding on all the death and destruction they caused. She turned to the Starbound with Ashvale, and she brought the Krell captain with her as a prisoner, and she told Lauren that they needed to make a choice, and that choice would define everything that came next, and either the Starbound could run away and maybe live a few more years before the Devourer consumed everything, or they could help her stop it, and probably die, but at least die fighting for something that mattered. Lauren called a crew meeting and explained the situation, and she was honest about the danger. And she told them that anyone who wanted to leave could take the escape pods and head for the nearest human colony, and nobody would judge them, and it was a perfectly reasonable choice when facing an extinction-level threat, and she waited for people to make their decision. A single crew member moved toward the escape pods, and Kate spoke up and said that humanity did not run from fights even when the fights were impossible. And Maya agreed and said they were scientists, and this is the discovery of the millennium, and maybe their last discovery ever, but it was worth it. And the pilot Sam Rivera said he had always wanted to do something that mattered, and fighting ancient evil seemed like a good enough cause. And one by one the crew voiced their support. Lauren looked at Selenia and told her that the Starbound would help stop the Devourer, and that humanity stood with her regardless of the cost. And Selenia stared at the captain for a long moment, and then she smiled, and it was a real smile this time, and not the polite mask she had been wearing, and she said that humans were either very brave or very stupid, and possibly both, and she liked that about them. She accessed ancient databases that were hidden in quantum folds of space and time, and her people had scattered these databases across the galaxy as backup storage, and she pulled information from places that human science said should not exist, and she found what she needed, and her expression grew grim. Because the news was not good, the Devourer had grown powerful, and it had consumed dozens of species already, and it was manifesting physically, which meant it was strong enough to exist fully in normal space, and that had not happened in millions of years. And the last time the Devourer reached that stage, it took 6 Guardians to stop it, and 3 of them died in the process. Elia began teaching Maya about precursor technology, and the concepts made quantum physics look simple by comparison, and Maya brain hurt trying to understand even the basic principles, but she persisted because understanding might mean the difference between survival and extinction, and Selenia was patient and explained things in ways that almost made sense. Kate worked with Selenia on adapting precursor technology to human systems, and it should have been impossible. But Kate was brilliant and stubborn and refused to accept that something could not be done, and together they created hybrid systems that combined ancient power with human innovation, and the results were crude but functional, and sometimes that was an Agashvel formed a bond with Sam, and the dragon found the human pilot interesting because Sam was fearless in ways that made no logical sense, and he flew the Starbound like he was dancing with death, and Ashvel appreciated that kind of reckless courage, and he allowed Sam to see through his eyes during flight, and suddenly the pilot could perform maneuvers that should have been impossible for a human. Vessel Selenia revealed more about her past during quiet moments between preparations, and she told them about the war against the Devourers and how it had lasted for thousands of years and consumed countless civilizations, and she spoke about her fellow guardians and how they had fallen one by one until only she remained, and she had sealed the last Devourer away and gone into stasis because she could not bear to watch another civilization rise, and Falmea asked why she had awakened now, and Selenia explained that her stasis pod was programmed to wake her if the seals on the Devourer prisons ever weakened, and the Krell tampering had triggered that alarm, and she had hoped to wake to a peaceful galaxy. But instead she woke to find that history was repeating itself. The Starbound crew worked without sleep for 3 days straight preparing for what was coming, and they knew it was not enough time, but time was not something they had in abundance, and the Krell prisoner told them that a massive assault was planned on New Terra, and that was a human colony with 40 million civilians, and the attack would happen in less than a week. Selenia said it was a trap designed to draw her out, and the Devourer wanted her dead because she was the only being left in the galaxy who knew how to permanently seal it away, and if she died, then nothing could stop it from consuming everything. And Lauren pointed out that they could not abandon 40 million people, even if it was a trap, and Selenia agreed and said that was exactly what the Devourer was counting on. They made plans, and the plans were desperate and probably doomed, but they were better than doing nothing, and Selenia would confront the Devourer directly, while the Starbound and any human forces they could gather would try to evacuate as many civilians as possible, and it was not a good plan, but it was the only plan they had the night before they left for New Terra. The crew gathered in the observation deck and looked out at the stars, and nobody spoke because there were no words adequate for what they were feeling, and Selenia joined them, and she held a cup of coffee and stood next to Maya, and the ancient woman said something that the scientist would remember for the rest of her life, however long or short. That might be Selenia told her that she had fought alongside hundreds of species over millions of years, and she had seen bravery in many forms, but there was something special about humanity, and humans knew they were fragile and small and temporary. But they fought anyway, and they loved anyway, and they hoped anyway, and that kind of courage was rarer and more valuable than any weapon or technology. Maya asked if they had any chance of winning, and Selenia was quiet for a moment, and then she said that hope itself was a kind of victory, and even if they failed, they would fail while standing together and fighting for something good, and sometimes that was enough to change the universe in ways that outlasted empires and Devourers, and even precursors. The Starbound jumped too faster than light travel, heading toward New Terra and toward a battle that would determine the fate of not just humanity, but potentially every living thing in the galaxy. And in the cargo hold, Ashville stretched his wings and prepared for war, and his eyes glowed with fire that had burned since the universe was young. The Starbound dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the coordinates Selenia had provided, and what they saw made everyone stopped breathing for several seconds, because floating in space before them was something that should not exist, and it was a massive structure built around a neutron star, and the structure was made from materials that reflected light in impossible ways, and the gravity well from the neutron star should have crushed anything that came close. But the precursor facility just sat there, defying physics, like physics were optional suggestions rather than fundamental law. Selenia guided them through a path that wound between gravity currents that would have torn the ship apart if they had deviated even slightly, and Sam flew with absolute precision while seeing through Ashvale eyes, and the dragon watched the currents and saw them in ways that human instruments could not detect, and together, they navigated the impossible and reached a docking port that opened. For them, like it had been waiting millions of years for someone to come home inside the facility, the lights activated automatically and illuminated corridors that stretched further than should fit inside any structure, and Maya realized with growing wonder that the interior was bigger than the exterior, and space itself was folded and compressed and expanded in ways that made her head hurt. When she tried to understand, the geometry Xenia led them deeper into the facility, and she moved with confidence like she was remembering a path her feet had walked countless times before, and they passed rooms filled with technology that hummed with dormant power and chambers, containing knowledge stored in crystals that glowed with soft light, and archives that held the history of civilizations that had turned to dust billions of years ago. She brought them to a central chamber that was vast and circular, and in the center stood a pillar of pure energy that pulsed with the heartbeat of the neutron star itself, and Selenia placed her hand on the pillar, and light poured from it and spread through the facility, like blood returning to a body that had been sleeping, and systems activated, and the facility woke up fully for the first time in millions of years. Maya and Kate spent hours learning from the ancient computers, and the knowledge was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once, and they learned about weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand stars exploding, and technologies that manipulated time and space like they were clay waiting to be molded. Zelenia taught them the basics of precursor science, and she explained that her people had learned to work with the fundamental forces of reality rather than against them, and human science tried to dominate nature, but precursor science tried to cooperate with it. And the difference was subtle but profound, and it meant that their technology did things that looked like magic, but were actually just very advanced understanding of how the universe really worked. Kate asked if they could install some of these systems on the Starbound, and Selenia laughed and said that installing precursor technology in a human ship was like installing a fusion reactor in a wooden boat, and it would probably work, but it would also probably explode. But she helped them anyway, because desperate times called for desperate measures, and they carefully integrated shields and weapons that would make the research vessel more combat capable. Meanwhile, Ashfell and Sam had formed a bond that went beyond simple communication, and the dragon had opened his mind to the pilot, and Sam could now perceive things that humans were not meant to perceive, and he saw the quantum probabilities that defined every moment, and he felt the currents of space-time that flowed around them, and when he flew the Starbound, now he did not just pilot it, he danced with it through dimensions that normal pilots could not access. The crew worked without rest because they knew the attack on New Terra was coming soon, and every hour they spent preparing was an hour that might save lives later. And Selenia pushed them hard, but she also took care of them, and she made sure they ate and slept at least a little, and she told them stories about the ancient times when her people were young and still learning and still making mistakes. She revealed more about the Devourers and explained that they were not evil in the way humans understood evil, and they were not malicious or cruel, and they simply fed on negative energy the way humans breathed oxygen, and they could not help what they were any more than a shark could help eating fish, and that made them dangerous but not villains. And the tragedy was that they could not coexist with life because life inevitably produced the negative emotions they needed to survive. Maya asked if there was any way to reason with a devourer, and Selenia said that precursors had tried for thousands of years, and the answer was always no, because devourers operated on logic that was alien and incomprehensible. And they saw living beings as food sources and nothing more, in trying to negotiate with. One was like trying to negotiate with a hurricane. The prisoner Krell captain had been confined to a secure room, and Selenia visited him regularly to extract more information, and she learned that the Krell Empire was massive and spread across hundreds of systems, and the Devourer had been subtly influencing their leaders for decades and pushing them toward more violence and more conquest because every death fed it and made it stronger. She also learned that the attack on New Terra would involve 300 Krell warships, and that was more firepower than humanity had ever faced, and the human defense fleet numbered only 87 vessels, and they were outmatched and outgunned, and their only advantage was that they would be fighting. To protect their home while the Krell were just following orders from a puppet master they did not even know existed, Laron contacted Human Command and explained the situation, and at first they did not believe her because the story sounded insane and involved ancient aliens and evil entities and impossible technology. But then Selenia spoke directly to the human admirals, and she showed them proof and demonstrated power that could not be faked, and they realized that everything was true. And they mobilized every ship they could. Spare the facility had more than just technology, and in the deeper levels, Selenia found something she had hoped was still there. It was a weapon called the Sundering Blade, and it was a sword forged from collapsed star matter and imbued with energy from the first moments of the universe, and it could cut through anything, including the fabric of reality itself. And she had wielded it in the ancient war, and seeing it again brought back memories both beautiful and painful. She also found armor that was stored in stasis, and it looked delicate, like it was made from glass and crystal, but it was stronger than any metal and lighter than air, and it would protect her from almost anything. And she put it on, and for the first time since waking, she looked like what she truly was, and she was guardian and a warrior and a protector of all living things. Maya watched Selenia transform from a friendly alien who liked coffee into something that radiated power and purpose, and the scientists felt both awed and terrified because this was the being who had fought wars that consumed galaxies and won, and now that being was on their side. And that should have been comforting, but instead it just emphasized how dangerous the Devourer must be if it took someone like Selenia to stop it the day before they were scheduled to leave for New Terra. Selenia called everyone together in the central chamber, and she told them that she needed to be honest about their chances, and the truth was that they would probably die, and even if they won the battle, they might lose the war, because there were 6 more Devourers still imprisoned, and if the seals on those prisons failed, then the galaxy was doomed. She gave them one last chance to leave, and no one would think less of them, and they could stay at the facility, where they would be safe, and she would go alone to face the Devourer. And at least some humans would survive to tell the story, but again, not a single person moved toward the exit. Sam spoke up and said that humanity had a saying, and it went like this: and you did not get to choose when you were born or when you died, but you did get to choose what you stood for, and he chose to stand against the darkness, even if standing meant falling. And Kate agreed and added that someone had to witness what happened, and if they all died, at least they would die knowing they fought for something real. Maya said something that made Selenia's eyes widen in surprise, and the scientist pointed out that the precursors had been powerful and advanced and nearly immortal, but they had still lost to the Devourers eventually, and maybe power was not enough, and maybe what was needed was something that the precursors had lost over their millions of years of existence, and maybe humans had an advantage, precisely because they were young and foolish and did not know when to quit. Selenia was quiet for a long moment, and then she laughed, and it was genuine laughter that filled the chamber, and she said that Maya was absolutely right, and she had spent so long being ancient and wise that she had forgotten what it felt like to be desperate and reckless and willing to try impossible things. Just because they might work, Shy made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself, and she said they were not just going to fight the Devourer, and they were going to kill it permanently. Yes, that was supposed to be impossible. And yes, no one had ever done it before, but humans specialized in doing impossible things, and she was willing to learn from them. The Starbound arrived at New Terra 3 hours before the Krell fleet was scheduled to attack, and the colony hung in space like a blue and green jewel, and 40 million people lived on that world, and most of them had no idea that death was coming. And the human defense fleet was already in position, and 87 ships ranged in defensive formations that looked brave and hopeless at the same time. Lauren contacted the fleet admiral and explained their plan such as it was, and the admiral listened with an expression that cycled between disbelief and desperate hope. And when Lauren finished, the admiral said that any help was welcome, even if that help came in the form of an ancient alien warrior and her dragon and a research vessel that had been upgraded with impossible technology. Celia stood on the bridge watching the colony through the view screen, and her face was calm, but her eyes, she betrayed concern because she knew what was coming, and she had seen this scene play out. Countless times across millions of years, and civilizations rose and fell, and the devourers fed, and nothing ever really changed except this time felt different. And she could not explain why the Krell arrived exactly on schedule in 300. Warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and they formed a wall of metal and weapons that blocked out the stars, and they immediately began broadcasting demands for surrender and threatening to destroy the colony if humanity resisted, and their commander was a different Krell than before, and this one had eyes that were completely black and wrong, and Selenia recognized the signs of devourer possession. The human fleet did not surrender, and instead they powered weapons and moved to intercept, and they were so badly outnumbered that the outcome seemed predetermined, but they flew anyway because that was what humans did. And they fought, even when fighting was futile, and Admiral Kane gave the order to engage in 87. Ships rushed forward to meet 300. Then Selenia acted, and she had been holding back before because she did not want to reveal her full power, but now was not the time for restraint, and she stepped into empty space outside the Starbound. Without a suit because she did not need one, and the vacuum did not touch her, and she raised her hands, and space itself responded to her willish veil, emerged from the cargo bay and grew to his true size, and he was massive beyond comprehension, and large enough that ships looked like insects next to him, and his scales reflected light from dimensions humans had no names for, and his eyes burned with fire that had witnessed the birth of galaxies, and he roared. And the sound traveled through space impossibly, and every ship in the battle felt it in their bones. The dragon dove into the Krell formation, and his claws tore through dreadnoughts like they were made of paper, and his tail smashed cruisers into fragments, and his wings created shockwaves that disrupted enemy formations, and everywhere he went, Krell ships died, and their weapons bounced off his scales like rain. Bouncing off stone Selenia was even more terrifying because she did not touch the enemy ships, and she did not need to, and she gestured in Krell. Vessels simply stopped working, and their engines died, and their weapons powered down, and their shields collapsed. And then she would make another gesture, and those ships would be pushed away from the battle like apparent moving toys out of a child path. The human fleet watched in awe and terror as the battle transformed from desperate last stand into something completely different. The Krell were not fighting humans anymore, and they were fighting forces they had no defense against, and their formation broke, and ships tried to flee, but Selenia had created a barrier around the battle space, and nothing could leave until she allowed it. But this was all just the opening act, and everyone knew it, and the real threat had not yet appeared, and Selenia could feel it coming, and the devourer was approaching, and it was manifesting physically. And that meant it was powerful beyond anything the current galaxy had faced before. The space near New Terra began to darken, and not just dark like the absence of light, but dark like the absence of everything, and reality itself seemed to flinch away from the wrongness that was emerging. And then the devourer was there, and it was massive and terrible and beautiful in the way that hurricanes and avalanches were beautiful. It looked like shadow given form, and it had no fixed shape, but instead flowed and changed, and parts of it seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. And where it passed, stars dimmed and ships corroded, and even the void itself seemed to rot and decay, and it radiated hunger that could be felt across light years. Possessed Krell commander screamed in triumph and ordered all remaining ships to attack the human colony directly, and the devourer wanted fear and death and suffering because those emotions would feed it and make it stronger. And the Krell ships that could still move turned toward New Terra. Empowered their weapon, Selenia made a choice, and she had been planning to fight the devourer alone while the human fleet evacuated the colony. But plans never survived contact with reality, and the civilians could not be evacuated fast enough, and the Krell would kill millions before rescue could arrive, and she could not allow that, and she would not allow that. She spoke to Maya through their communication link and told the scientists to coordinate with the human fleet, and she said they needed to broadcast something, and Maya asked what, and Selenia explained that the devourer fed on negative emotions and fear and hatred and despair, but it could not feed on positive emotions and hope and love and determination, and those things weakened it. Maya understood immediately, and she contacted Admiral Kanan explained what needed to happen, and at first the Admiral thought it was insane, but then he realized it was the kind of insane that just might work, and he gave orders and every human ship began broadcasting, and they transmitted every memory of hope and love and defiance. They possessed 40 million colonists, joined the broadcast, and they sent their hopes and dreams and love for their families, and determination too. Survive, and suddenly space was filled with emotional energy that the Devourer could not consume, and it recoiled like something that had touched fire, and for the first time in millions of years. A Devourer felt something like pain. Selenia struck while it was weakened, and she drew the sundering blade, and the sword blazed with light from the first moments of creation, and she moved faster than light and cut into the Devourer flesh, and the creature screamed, and the sound shattered three Krell ships just from the vibration-ishville, attacked from another angle, and his breath was not fire, and it was something far worse, and it was pure antimatter, and concentrated entropy, and the breath of endings, and where it touched the Devourer, the creature dissolved and unraveled, and ceased to exist, and the Dragon and the Guardian fought together like they had done 1,000,000 times before, across 1,000,000 battlefields. Devourer fought back with desperate fury, and it lashed out with tendrils of darkness that could unmake matter, and it created weapons from its own substance and hurled them at Selenia, and some struck her, and her armor held but barely, and she bled light instead of blood, and the wounds hurt in ways that transcended physical pain. The battle raged for hours that felt like years, and Selenia and Ashville drove the Devourer back again and again.
Ow.
But it kept reforming and adapting and growing stronger from its own rage and fear, and Selenia realized with growing horror that it might not be enough, and even with all her power, and all of humanity hoped they might still lose. Then something unexpected happened, and the human ships stopped just broadcasting emotions, and they started fighting the Devourer directly, and their weapons should not have been able to hurt it. But the weapons had been modified with precursor technology, and more importantly, they were fired by people who believed they could make a difference. Admiral Kane led the charge, and his flagship fired everything it had, and the weapons were powered not just by reactors, but by the determination of his crew, and the shots actually damaged the Devourer, and the creature recoiled in surprise, because prey was not supposed to fight back. Effectively, other ships joined in, and 87 vessels poured fire into the Devourer, and each shot was a small wound, but small wounds added up, and the creature was being hurt by beings it had considered beneath notice, and the Krell fleet watched in shock as humanity wounded a god. Selenia saw her opening, and she flew directly into the Devourer center, where its consciousness was concentrated, and she raised the sundering blade and plunged it into the heart of darkness, and light erupted, and the blade cut through dimensions and severed the creature connection to this reality. The Devourer screamed one final time, and then it collapsed inward, and Awalenia used all her remaining power to force it back into its prison, and she reinforced the seals with precursor technology merged with something new, and something that felt like human stubbornness and determination made manifest. The prison sealed, and the Devourer was trapped again, and Selenia had done something no Guardian had done before, and she had not just imprisoned it, and she had actually wounded it and weakened it, and maybe, just maybe, shown that these creatures were not invincible. She fell, and her power was completely exhausted, and she tumbled through space unconscious, and Ashville caught her before she could drift away. And the dragon was also wounded and bleeding from a dozen places, but he cradled his companion gently and flew back toward the Starbound. News of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than light, and within days every major civilization knew what had happened at New Terra, and humanity had stood alongside a precursor guardian and fought an extinction-level threat, and won. The implications were staggering, because humans were barely a century into space travel, and they were supposed to be primitive and weak, but they had helped wound something that ancient empires could not defeat. Ambassadors arrived from dozens of species, and they came to Earth and to the new orbital station that humanity was building, and they wanted alliances and trade agreements and technology exchanges, and some came because they were genuinely impressed, while others came because they were afraid of what humanity might become with precursor knowledge. The Krell Empire fractured within weeks, and member species realized they had been enslaved by an ancient evil, and rebellions broke out across hundreds of worlds in the Empire that had seemed invincible, collapsed like a house made of cards, and new governments formed in most of them. One had nothing to do with conquest and war. Selenia recovered slowly because even guardians needed time to heal from wounds that deep, and she spent weeks in medical on the Starbound, drinking coffee and talking with Maya about science and philosophy and the nature of hope, and the ancient woman said she had learned more from humanity in a few weeks than she had learned in millions of years of wandering alone. She made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself, and she chose to remain with humanity, and she said that humans reminded her of her own people before they became consumed by their power and before they grew complacent and stopped fighting for things that mattered, and maybe by staying with humans, she could remember what it felt like to be truly alive. The human government offered her citizenship in a ceremony that was broadcast across the entire planet, and the president stood before cameras and declared that Selenia was now an honorary human, and she had earned this not through birth, but through sacrifice and courage and willingness to stand with humanity when it mattered most. Selenia accepted, and tears rolled down her face, and they were the first tears she had cried in 10,000 years, and she said that she had been called many things across millions of years, and she had been guardian and warrior and precursor and immortal, but being called human was the greatest honor she had ever received. Maya was promoted to lead the new precursor research initiative, and she worked directly with Selenia to unlock ancient technologies and adapt them for human use. And the goal was not to copy precursor technology blindly, but to understand the principles and create human versions that fit human needs and human values. The research moved faster than anyone expected because Selenia was an excellent teacher and Maya was a brilliant student, and together they created hybrid technologies that combined ancient wisdom with human innovation, and the results were sometimes crude and often unstable, but they worked, and that was what mattered. Sam and Asheville became an official flight team, and the Dragon found the human pilot endlessly amusing, and he enjoyed flying with someone who treated death-defying maneuvers as a fun challenge rather than a terrifying risk. And they developed a bond that went beyond words, and when they flew together, they moved as one being across multiple dimensions. The Dragon spent most of his time coiled around the new orbital station that humanity was building, and the station was called Unity because it represented cooperation between species. And Asheville appointed himself guardian of the station, and he took his duty seriously, and nothing threatening came near Unity without the Dragon noticing. Captain Lauren Hayes was given command of a joint human-alien task force, and the mission was to hunt the remaining 5 Devourers and prevent them from escaping their prisons. And the task force included ships from a dozen species, and they all volunteered because the Battle of New Terra had shown that the Devourers could be fought. Maybe even defeated. The Krell prisoner who had provided information was given a choice, and he could face trial for war crimes, or he could join the task force and help hunt the evil that had enslaved his people, and he chose to help, and he said that redemption was worth more than survival, and Lauren accepted him because everyone deserved a chance to make things right. Ments passed, and Unity Station was completed, and it was massive and beautiful, and it orbited Earth like a second moon. And it contained research facilities and embassies and living quarters for thousands of beings from hundreds of species and children from a dozen worlds played together in the zero-gravity gardens and learned that differences were not something to fear. Selenia spent her days teaching and researching and occasionally sitting in the observation deck, drinking coffee and watching the stars, and she seemed more at peace than she had been in millions of years. And Maya asked her once if she missed her old life, and Selenia said that her old life had been lonely and powerful and ultimately empty, but this new life was chaotic and messy and absolutely wonderful. The ancient woman revealed that there was still much work to do, and 5 more Devourers were imprisoned, and the seals on those prisons would eventually weaken. And when that happened, humanity would need to be ready, but she also said that she believed they would be ready because humans had something that precursors had lost, and they had the ability to hope, even when hope was illogical. She explained that hope was not the same as optimism. Optimism was believing things would work out, and hope was deciding to fight even when you knew they might not. And that distinction was subtle but profound, and it was what made humanity dangerous to thee. Devourers, because creatures that fed on despair could not understand beings who refused to disper Maya. Asked if they had really wounded the devourer, or if it had just been imprisoned again, and Selenia smiled and said that for the first time in millions of years, a devourer had felt pain, and it had learned that prey could fight back, and that knowledge would spread to the other imprisoned. Devourers and they would be afraid, and fear was a weapon that could be used against them. Galaxy was changing, and old empires were adapting to new realities, and species that had been enemies for centuries were learning to cooperate, and Unity Station became a symbol of what was possible when beings worked together instead of fighting, and ambassadors came from across the known universe to see this miracle. Some species were skeptical, and they said that the alliance would not last, and that humanity was too young and too reckless, and that Selenia was foolish to trust them. But the ancient guardian would smile and point to the children playing in the gardens and ask, what better future could be built than one where children of different species grew up as friends? One evening, Maya found Selenia in the observation deck, and the ancient woman was holding a cup of coffee and staring out at the stars, and Maya joined her. They stood in comfortable silence for a while before Maya asked the question that had been on her mind for months. She wanted to know if they really had a chance of winning the larger war, and if humanity could survive what was coming, and if all their preparation would be enough. And Selenia took a sip of coffee and considered her answer carefully. She told Maya that victory was never guaranteed, and that devourers were ancient and powerful and cunning, and the coming battles would be harder than the Battle of New Terra, and many would die, and there would be moments when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. But she also said that she had fought this war before across millions of years, and she had fought it alone with only other guardians at her side. And they had been powerful, but they had also been arrogant, and they believed that power alone could win, and they had been wrong. This time was different, and this time she was fighting alongside beings who understood that power without purpose was meaningless, and humans fought not because they were strong, but because they refused to give up, and that stubbornness and that determination and that absolute refusal to accept defeat was worth more than all the weapons the precursors had ever built. Maya smiled and said that sounded like the kind of speech that people gave before dying heroically, and Selenia laughed and agreed, and then she raised her coffee cup in a toast, and Maya raised her own cup, and they clinked them together while standing in the observation deck of Unity Station, watching the stars shine in the darkness below them. Earth turned slowly, and above them the galaxy stretched out infinite and full of danger, and somewhere in the dark between galaxies 5 more devourers waited in their prisons, and they were ancient and hungry, and eventually they would break free, but they would not face alone. Guardian fighting a desperate holding action, and they would not face a galaxy divided and afraid, and instead they would face an alliance of species who would learn to hope and to fight and to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. The scanner had marked Selenia as precursor class, and that designation was accurate but incomplete, and she was so much more than just a relic of an ancient civilization, and she was a teacher and a friend and a guardian who had found something worth protecting against. She was also now officially human by choice, if not by birth, and she had learned to love coffee and terrible jokes and the chaotic beautiful mess that humanity brought to everything they touched, and she had decided that this was home, and these people were her people, and she would fight for them with everything.